Welcome to the Borders and Globalization podcast. Welcome to our listeners. My name is Ben. I'm a researcher with the Borders and Globalization project. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekwegan peoples in the Salish Sea region. Country of 27 million inhabitants in the Himalayan mountain range, Nepal shares a border with India for 1690 kilometers and with China for nearly 1,200 kilometers. The majority of the inhabitants live in the south of the country, along the Indo-Nepalese border and in the Kathmandu Valley. Today, we are going to talk about Nepal-India border, minorities, and cross-border networks with Kalpana Jha, writer, analyst, and researcher at the University of Victoria. Welcome on board, Kalpana. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to see you too.
Let's start the interview with your current research, please. You develop research on cross-border cooperation networks. Can you describe and explain to us your topic of research, please?
Sure. I won't exactly frame it as cross-border cooperation networks, but rather as cross-border informal networks. So my concern is more in terms of people-to-people relationships and the informalities of those networks, of how people interact across borders. In what terms? Do they support each other in one way or the other? In what ways do they support? What are the major aspects based on which they interact on an everyday basis? And if there are any conflicts that emerge around that, so that's also one of the aspects that cannot be overlooked, that there might be inherent conflicts as well. But rather more, I look at what type of informal interactions go around the border and how does that shape the border region that we have today at large, and how does it determine the border formation on an everyday basis. So, the border itself is not just a geography, not just a line. It does not just divide, but also has a function of bringing people together, and facilitating a level of interaction. So it has a life of its own, to my understanding. So that's what my research is. And I'm yet at a preliminary stage. I'm still developing it. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Kalpana. Thank you for this answer. You have a background in socio-legal studies. And I wonder what juridical or policy approach have you chosen to examine your research subject?
I find the socio-legal approach to it very interesting because it again brings you to the human aspect of it, that is why it's socio-legal. So how do people interact with the legal system? So obviously, when I say that, borders are not just lines, but they do have a legal aspect to it. That is why it's a border, right? So you can't really surpass what's there, what's inherent in the nature of that border because of the existence of states. So the way I see it is wherever the legal system intersects with the people living in that region. Because if you look at India-Nepal border particularly, it's a highly populous region, the border itself, like just 10 kilometers radius of the border, not even 10 kilometers, 2 kilometers radius of the border, and it would be populated. It's populous, it's people living over there. So they, on an everyday basis, again, do interact with these systems. So you do hear the conflicts that come up, with the state that's trying to balance and control that border, while the people who are trying to just live their lives, the way they have lived forever, like never paying heed to what the state is trying to enforce. but then they do come in contact with these systems on everyday basis, because they're crossing that border on an everyday basis, be it for buying goods, for daily shopping, for meeting friends, families, so they do it on an everyday regular basis. So that is one aspect of the legal thing that comes into my study. And the other thing would be also consciously examining the treaty arrangements and other border security arrangements, policing arrangements that exist around the border, just to look at the nature of these things and how they've survived for this long, and what impact does it really have on the border region and the lives of the people living over there on both sides. So that's how I approach it.
Great. Thank you for all these details, Kalpana. And you just spoke about the notion of border in general. You spoke about the border as a line of separation, but of course, a border is also a tool for reunification of the people. So I would like you, if you could develop a little bit more about this notion of border you are using. How do you use this notion in your research on the Nepal-India border? And finally, regarding the position of Nepal between India and China, what is a border for you?
This question, I find it very interesting, to be honest, because while I stick to my notion of understanding borders as region where people inhabit, so which gives life to the border itself, and talking about Nepal, if you look at how Nepal actually has survived for hundreds of years, it's one of the oldest geographical entities that has existed in this region. It has always been there before India even came into existence, after the British came in. So, but like that period of invasion, if you look at it, of colonization, Nepal has never completely been invaded by the British or has been colonized ever. So it was left, and the reason behind it was China, of course. Like, they didn't want to come so close to China, never. So Nepal, because of its fortress sort of a nature, because of the invincible Himalayas that it had at that point of time. Today, nothing is invincible. But at that point of time, the Himalayas were difficult to penetrate through. These were very difficult regions. Like, life didn't exist, right, over those places. So because of that, Nepal itself has now remained as a border between India and China. People like to use this term buffer zone, but I'm not very comfortable, because like I say, borders have lives as well. So it kind of, using that term undermines the agency. And it had survived. Nepal had survived. It has its own politics. It has a huge diversity, packed diversity. And for a limited geography, the population is pretty significant. So you can't undermine the agency of the nation itself as well. So yeah, while I do conceive it as a border between India and China, because these are magnanimous continent-sized countries, right? So subcontinents in themselves. So you can't really undermine that magnanimity of these countries as well. And them also trying to interact with Nepal, and Nepal trying to interact with these powers. There is no there's no balance in the kind of power these three entities share, and especially Nepal being so small and being like underdeveloped, economically not so stable, with so much of donors being present over there. Today, the entire world is present in Nepal, so how all that thing comes together is a whole story in itself. And a lifetime would be less to kind of unreveal this. But then, yeah, definitely, I do see that Nepal serves as a border, and that is how and that is what shapes its interaction with India and China at large. I don't know if I answered your question, but
It was very great. Thank you, Kalpana. Thank you for all these answers. Let's move on to a discussion of Nepal itself and its legal and political organization. The population living in Nepal comprises 125 human groups based on ethnicity with majority groups. That's amazing. And you just said that. It's very, very important. And there are also 124 languages spoken. How can this diversity be taken into account at the level of political, institutional, and administrative organization?
Yeah, this has been the biggest challenge in Nepal, to manage this diversity, right? So the very reason why Nepal moved into federalism was to manage its diversity. That was the primary rationale behind federalizing, because the diversity and the language had to be managed. Especially down south, there was a huge pressure right from 1950s to manage diversity, especially because the southern plains, or the region that is also known as Madeshi, is very strong in its linguistic diversity, I would say, or the language it's spoken over there. And they're very firm on it. And also wanting a separate identity from Nepal itself. It's kind of like within Nepal, the diversities got lost. So in a way, the very fact that today that there are 24 languages spoken, 125 ethnic groups that exist in Nepal is because of this change that happened in Nepal. Otherwise, it was unknown, it was known as a unitary, nice, sweet little kingdom with no diversity. There's just one language spoken, and there's one kind of people who live in that place. But today, because of this, it's at least known, it's at least listed, it's at least there. So that's the level where Nepal is today. But yeah, this managing of this diversity and addressing all the languages, all the groups, has been a very big challenge for Nepal, and still a challenge. To a level, federalism addresses it, but then we have a long way to go. So yeah, it remains there. It's an incomplete process.
Yeah, thank you, Kalpana. Yeah, you just spoke about this federal status of Nepal, and that's my following question. A king started the unification of Nepal 300 years ago. After having been an independent kingdom for a long time, and after a civil war from 1996 to 2006, Nepal became a republic in 2008, and the country adopted a new constitution in 2015, which provides, as you said, a federal type state organized around 7 provinces, which have their own assembly and executive power. The current official name of Nepal is Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal. What was the impact of this new constitution on the population? And have there been any objections?
There has been a great deal of objection. Actually, this 2015 constitution was passed amidst huge problems in Nepal. There were protests happening. Almost 50 people died, especially from the Madhesi region. There was a huge resistance because it did not address the diversity the way it should have. Especially the Madhesi region has been shrunk to 8 districts, while the claim is 22 districts. So the entire stretch on down south, the demand was that that stretch be declared a federal unit, a province, but that didn't happen. So there was very big resistance from there. And there was a long border blockade between Nepal and India when the constitution itself was being passed. So, of course, there's international concerns that plays around whatever goes internally in Nepal for sure. So yes, this really came around, and then there are problems with citizenship provisions, because that renders women in Nepal a second-class citizen. The current citizenship arrangements, they're not really yet there, where a woman is kind of barred from providing citizenship either to her child or her spouse. So that is there, which generally also mostly impacts the people from this region, because we have the custom of marrying across the border. So that's there. So it is still a contention. The constitution still needs a lot of amendments, and but yeah, after a point of time now, things have been settled down. So the explicit conflict is now contained, but implicit conflicts still remain, and especially surrounding this constitution. So the response of a larger population to this constitution, if you ask, is not great. It's not a constitution that's amazing or great, like most of the politicians have claimed that it is one of the best constitutions in the world, which it is not. And most people would agree, the general masses, especially women, vis-a-vis the citizenship arrangements would agree. People down south in the Madhesi region would agree that it did not really address the proportional representation issue. Also, it brings in a lot of controversial arrangements in terms of controlling power of the provinces. So the provinces cannot make their laws or provisions or policies that is in conflict with the policies at the center. So that's one of the biggest binding factors, that, if there is a peculiar need of a province which is not in line with the federal state, with the central state, they cannot make those laws or policies even. So there are a lot of problems with the constitution. It is still surrounded with controversies, but it's more like a functional controversy at this point of time, where people are taking bits and pieces of it and trying to make it work in whatever arrangement has been achieved thus far.
Great. Thank you very much, Kalpana. Let's move now on the section about the relations between Nepal and India. The geographical location of Nepal, with the Himalayas in the north of the country, tends to bring it closer to India in the south, and its great power of influence. So my question is this one: what is the general context of Nepal vis-a-vis India? Huge topic.
Yeah, it is indeed a huge topic. And like you said, India definitely exerts greater influence in Nepal, also given the geographical proximity and the ease of that and accessibility of that proximity, and the kind of relationships it has shared since ancient past. The religion, the culture, the language, everything matches with India. So that gives India an obvious advantage in Nepal, because Nepalese can interact with Indians and Indians can interact with Nepalese, right? However, it is also full of contentions politically, because anti-India politics has been the core of vote bank politics in Nepal, and most of the Madhesis bear the brunt of that. So face racism in Nepal, face issues of discrimination in Nepal, and being called Indians, or less Nepalese, or being called even traitors, is common for Madhesis to hear, because they are seen as much closer to India. Like I said, because Madhesis share a close kinship tie in India, like it's an everyday thing. The families live across borders. There's cross-border marriages are very common as compared to other parts of Nepal in southern plains. So the line of politics ever since the monarchs were there in Nepal has always been anti-India. Its tone, the undertone of politics has always been anything that's anti-India is pretty sellable politically, you know, in terms of vote for polarizing people, for dividing people in terms of like, you know, pro-India and anti-India people. So that polarization has been pretty great in Nepal. It's pretty deep. And of course, the of course, like I said earlier, also the border blockades and, you know, things like that. And border blockades, we've had about 3 in the past with India. So one of the great things that we share with India is an open border. And it's very important for Nepal, for its survival, right? But at times, and again, there have been blockades that have been imposed, which has brought cold waves in the relationship. So just the recent past in 2015, the blockade that happened for almost 12, 13 months wasn't easy for Nepal to survive. So these kind of problems keep happening because India wants an upper hand into the internal politics of Nepal as well. So that kind of keeps creating a kind of problem, you know. So that's
the situation. Okay. Thank you, Kalpana. Besides the political or cultural challenges or tensions, there is a form of economic interdependence on both sides of the border between the two countries, a form also of asymmetry, but also at the local level in certain places. I'm thinking of the Indian town of Benbassa, whose trade depends for 80% on customers from Nepal, while 68% of Nepal's exports go to India. So my question is this one: what is the day-to-day reality at the border between neighboring and close populations? You said it's kind of an open border, but I would like to know a little bit more about the lives at the daily level.
Of course, it's an open border, and at a daily level, at the very core of that relationship is that open border. That is why people are able to move across borders, and it's not just Banbasa, but pretty much all the border towns in India are dependent on Nepali customers. There are many of them. Like each border town in India is extremely vibrant, you know, because of this cross-border movement of people, because people pretty much do all their daily shopping, you know, they buy their goods in India. So that is what makes the Indian side of the market vibrant on one hand. On the other, Nepalese buy their goods in India is because it's cheaper there. You know, because we import pretty much everything from India. Although we might be exporting 80% and 60% of our goods, we pretty much import everything from India. So it becomes expensive over here, but it's rather cheaper on the other side. So that makes, you know, life of people easier to be able to buy like cheaper goods from across the border. And the day-to-day reality, not just at economic level, but it is at various different levels, right? Like I've been pointing out earlier in my when I'm talking as well, the people-to-people relationship is not just about that. It's also about floods, you know, it's also about natural disasters. It's also about family relationship. It's also about kinship ties. It's also about conflicts. It's also about friendships. It's about everything, you know. It's like a family living together, and every dynamic that you will find in that family, you will find in this cross-border everyday relationships. That reality is pretty much defined like it would be defined within a family. So floods brings controversies because it creates havoc, it creates problems in lives of the people. They end up blaming each other, that your country is responsible for my plight, and the other one would say, no, your country is responsible for my plight, because people are desperate. However, they also at the same time end up forming support groups, because in the floods people land up in each other's territories. You never know. So there's also support that goes into that, right? They also support each other. They don't throw each other out of the territories. So there's also a support system that's functioning over there. On the other hand, the families, cross-border marriages, that's an obvious system of support.
Right.
It could be just at the familial level. It could be economic. At the same time, it could also be political, because many influential politicians in Nepal married to Indian families, like powerful Indian families, especially the monarchs in the past. It was a custom to marry in the monarch's family across India, because there are many, many, many families which are no more monarchies, but they're still royal families in India. So marrying across is very common. So that's the reality of the neighborhood on the everyday basis. So it's not just 1, 2, 3, but multiple factors that actually define the realities on the borderlands on a daily basis. So I'm not just talking about, when I talk about these cross-border powerful marriages also, it's also on the borderlands, the people who live like in the adjacent border towns of Nepal and India also get married. And these are also sometimes like, between political powerful families of those places. So that is also defining the dynamic of the space. So what kind of relationships? So there are various different levels. A rickshaw puller might be married to a woman across the border, but also the king on the other side. The rich men would be married to women on the other side. So, this is the kind of dynamic that exists. And there might be, some benefits coming in from there, or maybe not. It's just an everyday thing that we've been married across the border forever. So, it's just a continuity of that. Or anything else, we've always been buying our goods across the border, So it's like that. Like we've always gone to sell our rice across the border and brought wheat from the other side. So that's the kind of relationship, and that continuity kind of, you can see it even today.
Great. Yeah, when I listen to you about the open border, maybe it's a no border phenomenon, which is built with tons of interrelationship between people at the daily level. It's an amazing case study. It's an amazing situation. Thank you for sharing all these insights. And in contradiction with the concept of open border, some authors recommend the construction of an 18 or 8 kilometers wall on the Nepal-India border. What do you think of this idea to build a wall of 1,808 kilometers?
Well, I believe whoever said this must have thinking of themselves as Donald Trump of Nepal, of the local space. But that's the most bizarre idea I've ever come across, is building a wall, constructing a fence. You do hear these things, but they don't hold any value, or it does not hold in case of Nepal and India. I don't think this is ever possible to do it in that region in particular. People will next day just turn down the wall and they'll say, I have family across the border, how dare you? It would be it's just, I think, a populist idea, when it's mostly used during elections, and I've heard politicians say this multiple times, but right now, at this point of time, as somebody who studies borders, this is something that I really cannot speak to or even think of or imagine even in next 100 years between Nepal and India.
Yeah, for sure. Nepal is a country of 6,000 rivers where agriculture predominates up to 80%, and there is a little or no industrial system yet.
Mhm.
And you spoke about that a little bit. And Nepal seems to be threatened by global warming with the melting of glaciers. In 2022, among many other projects, Nepal and India agreed to build a dam on a cross-border river. What do you think? Is this a sign of win-win cooperation for the two countries? And how are water governance and energy challenges unfolding around Nepal?
Although Nepal is like rich in fresh waters and has a huge potential of generating hydroelectricity, electricity energy has always been a challenge for Nepal. It has never been able to generate to its full capacity for obvious reasons. It does not have that capacity to invest and generate. So I grew up in Nepal in my late teens and early 20s with 18 hours of power cuts in Nepal. I've seen that time. So energy has always remained a challenge. Building dams have never proven beneficial for Nepal and India. There's always, and there's an example of Koshi and Gandak dams that were built, which are now until today the reason behind like some of the most dangerous floods, and flash floods have become common because of climate change. Because of the dam, the flood just kind of goes everywhere. The breach happens pretty much every year in that dam, and people have to pay the prices of it. And then the blame game begins between the two countries in terms of I didn't do it and I didn't do it. So that's been a problem. And usually the dam constructions and the treaties around it, the understanding, the MOUs that happen around these constructions are generally not on equal terms. So it's more beneficial to India. India reaps more benefit because it invests in that project. Nepal has very little to get from it. Most dams are not built after good study or survey, and it does not really look at a long-term impact on how this might turn out. So far, all the dams that have been built have been surrounded with controversy in Nepal. There is a recent power trade agreement that has happened between Nepal and India, which is a good start, I would say. The power trade is a good thing because if they're building hydropower plants and we do not really have anywhere else to sell, so we are dependent on a single market, which is India. And of course, India is energy starved forever. It's a booming industry and a huge population, so it always requires energy, and Nepal can be that exporter of that much required energy. So I think there's a positive and a negative to it. I really, at this point of time, I cannot stand in support of these cross-border dams because they have never reaped a good result. It's never been a win-win cooperation between the two countries. And like I said, energy is a very big challenge for Nepal. We still are unable to provide a full amount of energy that's required for the full population. There's still villages, rural areas that don't get electricity minimal, not to the extent they can use, they still get power cuts more than 4 or 5 hours a day. Some of the places it has not reached at all because of the geographical difficulties. So it's a big challenge for us. And also the management between Nepal and India, it never kind of plays out on an equal footing.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing with us all these informations from the ground, from the reality of Nepal. Let's move on the next section of our interview. That's the section about the relations between Nepal and China. The delimitation of the border between China and Nepal was the subject of several agreements in the early 1960s. Some traditional customary boundary have been replaced by modern boundary line. In the majority, the border is drawn on the watershed line. We know that certain tensions have arisen around a few border markers or even on the Mount Everest because of the COVID epidemic. China wanted to establish a dividing line so they could monitor climbs on their side. What are the relations between Nepal and China and its implications in terms of border? What could you tell us about that?
Nepal and China is a very recent phenomena. It was in the past Nepal and Tibet that actually shared relationships of trade, of crossing borders, of having Nepal even had a sort of a, what would you call it in those days? I don't know, but a consulate sort of an arrangement with Tibet. So with Tibet, they have had relationships. With China, it's recent. It's very recent. Especially after Xi Jinping's regime, it has become a little more evident, Otherwise, Nepal-China relationships have, there's so much dynamics in Nepal-India relationship, but Nepal-China does not really have that sort of dynamics, Although most of the time the popular leaders would want to, manifest a pro-China sentiment. But that's remained politically kind of undermined, or even in an everyday conversations or an everyday level, it's not so much a part of our conversation as much as India is. So that is one dynamics that defines in Nepal and China. Therefore, like whenever we have controversy with the border arrangement between Nepal and India, it's a huge thing. But the Nepal and China border pretty much remains absent from the conversations. The media does not want to cover it. Recently, there has been some scholars and journalists who've started going to Nepal-China border and have started looking at what sort of problems are there. So we also had recently a committee that was formed to go and look at Nepal-China border, and it was very difficult to locate where the border was there itself. So there's encroachment there as well from Chinese side, but that does not get articulated as often and as naturally as it does for India. So even the boundary on Mount Everest, it's so interesting because the Everest, the peak, is the boundary, right, between Nepal and China. Like people climb on it from Nepal, people climb on it from China, and it wants and India's and China's approach has always been a status quo. They want to have that status quo in whatever geographical territory they're present. And Everest is one of them. And it's very important. It's the tallest peak in the world. It lies in their territory. So they would like to have that status quo. And they're also capable of, enforcing that status quo on the Everest. Had it not been that the entire world was concerned with it, it would have done what it wanted to do on the Everest. It's just because everybody in the world is so concerned, and it's so fundamental also to the ecology and also to environment, that nobody messes with peaks like that.
Yeah.
That it could not really forward its status quo there. And also, in a way, you can say that its relationship with Nepal isn't that bad. So, it does not really want to push that further with Nepal either. In terms of implications on borders, like I said, of course, like Nepal is in no place to negotiate its border, either with India or with China. It has tried with India, never succeeded. With China, there's such limited level of conversation altogether. The communication itself is very difficult. So also in terms of our leadership, it does not really stand its ground so much with our neighbors when it comes about negotiating the borders. So with China, there has never been, that conversation so far. They've only started paying attention to the borders with China when the journalists the scholars started going in there and started doing their study over there. Now it's kind of coming into a general public's consciousness and attention. And the politicians are now forced, the leaders are forced, the authorities are forced to go over there, stay there, look at it. But beyond that, I don't think there's anything else that has happened over there. The territories have remained in controversy with both the countries, not just one.
Great.
And of course, China is a different story altogether.
Okay, thank you, Kalpana. Among the links between China and Nepal, it appears that Nepal is also a strategic country for the program of the new Silk Road from China. There is a talk of railways between China and Nepal. India, on its side, has also proposed similar competing projects. What do you think of this development of international and cross-border transport infrastructures for Nepal and its provinces? For some authors, these infrastructures are the expression of the hard power of neighboring countries and their huge powers. What do you think?
Yeah, India has, I think, already started. It just finished one of its railway projects, which was already there that we shared with India earlier, but it was kind of revamped and it was remade. So now we have a proper railway line connecting Nepal and India in one part, which is Janakpur-Jayanagar, and that's the only railway that we have in Nepal. And I think some study is already being done for another railway. And China definitely proposed a railway line between Nepal and China recently. And I would love to see what that unfolds into, because I'm still not able to kind of see why China would invest so much only to connect with Nepal. Or is the larger goal to connect with India? Because in terms of trade, the larger trading partner are India and China, not Nepal and India, or not Nepal and China. Nepal and China has no trade whatsoever. It's below 2%, I think, the trade relations. So I wonder what would that look like and how that project would unfold, because that's very much unclear still. Although they've said that there will be a railway line, but from where to where? What does it connect? Which territories does it connect? It will definitely not want Tibet connected with Nepal, because that's one of the viable ways in which China and Nepal would be connected. So from which territory is it planning to connect to Nepal with? And to which territory of Nepal is it planning to connect with? And why? What are the regions? Or maybe, that it can just say that just for, friendly relations, we just want connectivity. That's fine too. As long as connectivity is coming to Nepal, it's beneficial for Nepal as well. Maybe people will start taking the train to China instead of the flights. It would be good. Maybe the trades will foster a little more. maybe not just 2%, it'll be a little more. But then the whole program does not seem very clear to me yet, to my understanding yet. So yeah, that's my understanding of these, and it's definitely competing powers and status quo, like I said. So one over the other. India and China are greatest competitors, for that matter. So, but one thing that was good was it triggered India to complete its railway and the road project. So they are starting to now expedite the road project that has been stalled for over 20 years. And they just completed the railway project that was stalled for years and years together. So that's one thing. But yeah, definitely the competing powers cannot be cancelled. And Nepal should be cautious of the rampant infrastructure development from all sides into Nepal, because Nepal does not necessarily have the capacity to control it after it's done.
Yeah.
If it entails something not too friendly for Nepal, Nepal will not have the powers to control whatever goes on after that. So
Good point. Yeah, very good point, Kalpana. Now let's move on the last part of our interview about the Madhesi people. You wrote a book in 2017 about the Madhesi upsurge and the contested idea of Nepal. And I have several questions about it before the end of our discussion. First of all, what was the main idea of your book? Could you explain to us, please?
Like the title suggests, the Madhesi upsurge and the contested idea of Nepal. This book is primarily about the Madeshi movement that happened in 2006, 7, 8, and then also in 2015. It talks about why the Madeshi movement happened, and the core idea of Madeshi movement was to contest the idea of Nepal. To establish their identity within the Nepali territory. Because Nepal has always been known as this, like I earlier also pointed out, a singular notion of Nepal that is defined by a single language, single ethnic group, and a single kind of even geographical construct, like you also say it's a mountainous, it's a hilly, but it's also, large population. Over 50% of the population actually reside in the plains.
In the Terai.
In the Madeshi region, in the southern part of it. So it's so undermined, less understood. Like, you met me and you maybe came across this book and you know that there is this region that exists, right? Otherwise, many people still, they're still in that understanding of Nepal that it's all Mount Everest and mountains and mountain flights and trekkings, and there's nothing beyond that. So my book was to highlight this aspect, of the Madhesi uprising, and to say why the uprising happened, and what did it establish. So while I explain what went on when the uprising was happening, how did it unfold, and I also establish, because people generally end up thinking that it just started in 2007 or 2006 or 2008 when Madhesi started agitating, or in 2008 when the big uprising, the uprising that happened. That was not a singular phenomena, It wasn't just then that the uprising was in making for past 60 years. And then the uprising finally happened when the monarch was gone, when the time was ripe. Democracy was onsetting, and democracy is what provides voice to the marginalized groups. And also, like the Madhesi population itself, if you talk about in comparison to how the population is categorized in Nepal, is not a minority group. They're pretty significant in their population. So, so that was the whole idea of the book, to basically establish the fact that Nepal is not a singular entity. It's diverse.
Very diverse. And yes, Nepal is rather mountainous, but not only mountainous. There are low altitude areas like the Terai. It's a piece of land, a huge piece of land at 100 meters above sea level, the southernmost, forming part of the Great Plain of the Ganges in India. My question is related to this topographical diversity. That's a very interesting thing. Is there a type of cultural or even political internal border in Nepal based on the difference in landscape between mountain and plain?
Geographically, they've always been dividing lines in themselves, the mountains, the hilly regions, and the plains. Ethnically, there has always been this clear-cut divide between the mid-hills people, who are known as Pahari people, and the Madesis, the people who live in Madhes. So ethnically, that line has always been very stark and differentiated. Like I also earlier pointed out that Madesis face a lot of discrimination in Nepal based on their skin color, because they're darker in complexion, they come from the plains, it's hotter over there. Based on language, they're called names. There are multiple slangs that are used to address these people as ethnic groups. So the border is actually drawn in that sense, where the identities are divided, where people, do you mind if I give an example?
Of course.
I myself come from the plain, right? I'm a Madhesi myself. I don't know if I can. So I was working in multiple spaces for a while in Kathmandu, and there was this one conversation that was very interesting. Is this man, we celebrate the same festivals pretty much between the Pahari people and the Madhesi people, right? But there are different ways of celebrating it. The ways in which we celebrate it might be different a little bit, not too much. But this man constantly kept telling me that you don't celebrate a certain festival, but you celebrate a certain other festival. And, so that is how they assert the difference, They want to make you look different from them. Just be add something so trivial as celebrating festivals. You can celebrate anything, anywhere, and be anywhere, and you don't really have to demarcate lines based on that. But this man was actually demarcating lines based on what he celebrates is different from what I celebrate. Wow. And he was very persistent on that. It's very interesting to note these kind of divisions. Similarly, in everyday language of these mid-hills people is that slang in which they would address the Madhesi people. So it's just like a language for them, but for me it's discrimination. It's a slang. So that sort of division has always existed. The other very stark division geographically was drawn during King Mahendra's regime in 1960s.
Okay.
Which was the East-West Highway, the longest highway that connects Kathmandu to the plains. And the way, if you look at that highway, the way it's been constructed, it has been constructed to keep the people of the plains outside the reach of that. They drew it just in between somewhere,
Yeah.
And so that it's accessible to the hilly people, but not to the Tarai region, The Tarai, the plains, are at least 25 kilometers from that highway everywhere. So it made sure that it left people. And the way, if you look at the geography, if you look at that particular, you will see how borders are internally actually, in reality, tangibly drawn. And symbolically, this highway actually separates the plains from the hills.
Wow.
And symbolically, it also separates the people from the plains
Mm.
and privileges the people of the hills, over the people in the plains, while um, the people in the plains produce the largest economy. They produce the largest amount of income for the country. They are the food grain, they're the food basket of the country. Everything is actually being supported. And even today, just recently, I saw that 50% of customs are collected from the plains region because all the custom points are over there, right? And the amount that Tarai region gets from there is 5%.
Okay.
So there's such a so how many borders can be drawn internally is to my understanding unlimited, that Nepal has actually drawn symbolically, tangibly, politically, institutionally. It is always like it's a very, very stark division between the two communities. But today, at least, we're able to say that we're Madhesis. We have an identity, right? Earlier, we were just a slang for the country, insignificant people. So yeah, that's the dynamics pretty much.
And Kalpana, you just spoke about the Madesh people. So my question, and we didn't speak about that, and it's time for the discussion about the identity of the Madeshi people. What does the expression of Madeshi people mean? How do the Madeshi people determine their identity and their otherness?
The very word Madhesi is internalized by the people in the Tarai and have been articulated as a ethnic sentiment, as a ethnic identity to define themselves, is actually in reaction to the slang Madise. The term Madise was used to address these people. So the people who come from the Madhes region, the Tarai region, are Madhesi people. So that was internalized and was articulated as Madhesi by the Madhesis to define their identity and their difference from the people, from the Pahari people, from the people who reside in the Pahar. So Madhesi in itself is actually everything that a Madhesi person would be, from the food we eat, to the dress we wear, to our skin color, to the language we speak. So it is, when I say Madhesi, I'm referring to all these things that I am, that defines me as a person, and the language I use to communicate, the clothes I wear, the customs I follow, the traditions I follow, everything. So it's kind of a bundle in itself to express an identity that's different from their Pahari counterparts. And it's primarily to assert that difference that this term was needed. Otherwise, the Madesh movement itself, if you look at it 50 years ago, was actually a movement on, it was basically a regional movement. A territorial geography was what was being demanded. But over a period of time, because there were so many impositions in 1960s particularly, of language, of people from the Pahar, were from the mountains, hills, were made to migrate into Tarai and were given lands of the people from Tarai to cultivate and live on. So it was kind of an infiltration and a threat that was created by the state to these people who define themselves as Madhesis today. So Madhesi wasn't always the identity through which we expressed ourselves. We were mostly people from the Tarai. But over a period of time, it became a necessity to express it ethnically, because the identity was threatened, not just in one way, but in multiple ways. And the slang, that was used. So we needed an answer to that as well. So it became a kind of a politico-cultural identity attached to a territory, attached to a geography, which was expressed post 2006, very explicitly, and the geographical demand was tied to that. So ethnicity is also formed over a period of time, and Madhesi identity is a very strong example of that. That, at times, because of course it comes with a lot of baggage to it, the whole term ethnicity. But yeah, actually it carries a baggage, and that is how it gets constructed over a period of time. Because this wasn't really the way people chose to express themselves 60 years ago. But past 20 years, they've formulated this because it became mandatory, necessary, to assert their identity.
Thank you, Kalpana. Will you say the Madeshi or the Madeshi people are a minority in Nepal? They are also a minority in India? They are a cross-border minority, or they are not a minority? It's a strong community inside Nepal and a strong community inside India. How do you situate the balance of the powers for the Madeshi people? Because as you said, they live in the Terai region. They have a lot of power about agriculture, about commerce. So maybe other parts of the Nepal are simply jealous of your identity. What do you think?
Well, I don't know, jealous or not, but of course they're not a minority. And in India, definitely not a minority. There's a full state of Bihar full of people like Madhesis. And Bihar is the largest, it's the most populous. But definitely there's internal diversity within Madhes as well. So the caste divisions, which does make certain communities within the Madhesi community also minorities and extremely marginalized. But if you talk about Madhesi at large, the way the ethnicity is defined, it's very it's pretty significant. It's not a minority, definitely marginalized over years because of the imposition of single language, or keeping them consciously out of the state, keeping them away, geographically marginalized. So that has definitely rendered them marginalized, but they're not a minority. I'd maintain that. And they also, in India, it would not be called Madhesis. They're Biharis or the UPites, right? People living in Uttar Pradesh or people living in Bihar is their identity. So the identity changes, when you move across the border. We are the same people. We speak the same language. We follow the same culture, same customs, same traditions. Everything is same. Just the geographical division, and the requirement to be legally and politically identified within the territory we're situated in led to this identity called Madhesi, and that is how the Madhesis are there. And our identity definitely is transnational. I always maintain that. And when we travel transnationally, when I go visit my family in India, I would rather not be a Madhesi person, but rather be one of them, So my identity traverses geographies, and so does every Madhesi's identity. So, to try and make that distinction would not be fair in one place. And definitely, I will not call them minorities. For sure, no, because Nepal is a country of minorities. There's no population that is 50% or 51% of the population at large. So it's hardly 18%, 17%, 20%, So in that comparison, Madhesis would not be minorities for sure.
Great, thank you for these precisions. With the new constitutional system, there is a recognized province of Madesh. You said that. But did that change the claims for the Madesh people to be recognized at the constitutional level with their own province, with their own assembly, etc.? What you could say? What could you say?
It gave them a recognition, of course. That is what it has done. The claims did not get addressed, I would say. Like I said, it's not just 8 districts. It's more than that. So that did not get addressed. There are a lot of other concerns of Madhesis which have not been addressed by the state of Nepal, by the constitution. So there still remains a lot of things. But one thing that got established is their identity and the geography, of course. That did get recognized, and those were also core demands emerging from Madhes. So it's not that the claims have changed so much. It just establishes the claims that they had made to an extent.
Okay. Great, Kalpana. And now that's the last question of our interview, and it's about the borderlanders in general. It's about the communities which live at the border and in cross-border dimension. And what is your ideal scenario about this type of communities, borderlanders, at the border and cross-border communities? What's your dream? What's your ideal projection?
First thing I would say is I don't know if there can be an ideal projection in the given affairs of statehood and, of countries and nations and nation claims and states having their own assertions. But for me, if I am to articulate, the transnationality should be recognized, because that really solves a lot of problems automatically. States trying to assert unnecessary control, a control that cannot be materialized in its full, but that is what states strive to do. The very reason why this control cannot be asserted is because of the transnationality of these people, inherent in them. They've always traversed geographies. They've always transcended geographies, and they will continue to do so. So that's my way of thinking of these borders. And India-Nepal border can be a very good example. So an open border arrangement, where people can freely move around without interruptions from the authorities, recognizing the fact that this is the reality of the geography and the people living here. It would reduce so much violence. It would reduce so much burden from the states themselves of wanting to and trying to control an entity that cannot, and it's not meant, or in its nature, it kind of carries that character of uncontrollability. It cannot be tied down. So I think these are 2 things that I would really say that would really resolve a lot of problems.
Thank you, Kalpana. I love this transnationality concept. And maybe in the future, instead of to have only national identity card, we could think and we could imagine a transnationality identity card. Maybe it could help, as you said, some situations. And the border between Nepal and India is an extremely very important and interesting example. Thank you very much, Kalpana Jha, for participating in our podcast series. It was a great discussion on the challenges for Nepal, the communities at the borders and cross-border networks, informal networks. And thank you very much again.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for having me in the podcast. It is wonderful to be a part of your podcast. I could share whatever I thought.
Exactly. It was an amazing discussion. I learned a lot about Nepal and the Madeshi people, and it's very interesting discussion and very interesting topic for me and for BIG, of course. So So thank you very much and see you later. This was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Thank you for your attention and see you soon for the next issue. Bye-bye.